The soft, blue luminescence of a phone screen cut through the suffocating darkness of the master bedroom. Julian Forrester, lead prosecutor for the city of Philadelphia, paused his late-night pacing. The glowing device rested on the nightstand next to his sleeping wife, Lavinia. It was 2:14 a.m. A single notification banner hovered on the locked screen. Dominic, I left my watch on your hotel nightstand. Also, I have the files that will destroy Julian's case tomorrow. Sweet dreams. The air in the room instantly turned to lead. Dominic wasn't just a random name. He was the star witness in the sprawling corruption trial Julian was set to open in less than 48 hours. If stories of dark ambition, treacherous secrets, and the devastating price of revenge speak to your soul, stay with me. The gavel is about to fall. The rain over Philadelphia was relentless, a torrential downpour that hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Center City penthouse. Inside, the only light came from the sprawling cityscape and the muted glow of a desk lamp in the far corner of the bedroom. Julian Forrester stood perfectly still. At 42, he was the city's most feared prosecutor, a man whose sharp jawline and colder, calculating eyes had intimidated countless mob bosses and corrupt politicians. But right now, his heart was hammering against his ribs with a frantic, uncharacteristic terror. He was supposed to be reviewing the final witness transcripts for the Rossi Syndicate trial, the crowning achievement of his career. Instead, his gaze was locked on the opposite side of the king-sized bed, where his wife, Lavinia, lay breathing softly. The silk sheets draped elegantly over her shoulder. She was beautiful, an elite criminal defense attorney whose icy composure matched his own. For 8 years, they had been the undisputed royalty of the Philadelphia legal scene. A partnership of minds, if no longer of passion. Then, her phone illuminated. It was a small, innocuous vibration against the marble top of the nightstand. Ordinarily, Julian would never look. They respected each other's privacy. It was a silent clause in the unwritten contract of their marriage. But at 2:14 a.m., the sharp blue light commanded attention. Julian stepped closer, his bare feet silent on the plush carpet. He looked down. The screen was locked, but the notification banner was glaringly visible. Dominic, I left my watch on your hotel nightstand. Also, I have the files that will destroy Julian's case tomorrow. Sweet dreams. The air in the bedroom seemed to vanish. Julian forgot how to breathe. A cold, heavy stone plummeted into the pit of his stomach, radiating a numbing chill through his veins. Dominic. It wasn't a common name in their circle. There was only one Dominic who mattered right now. Dominic Beaumont. The charming, slippery accountant who served as the linchpin of the Rossi Syndicate, and Julian's star witness. The man who had agreed to testify for the prosecution in exchange for immunity. Julian stared at the words until the letters began to blur. My watch on your hotel nightstand. The implication was a physical blow, violent and sudden. Lavinia, his brilliant, meticulous wife, was sleeping with a mob accountant. But the betrayal of the flesh was only the first cut. The second sentence was a death sentence to his career. The files that will destroy Julian's case. Lavinia shifted in her sleep, a soft sigh escaping her lips. She turned her face away from the light, completely unaware that the foundation of their entire existence had just fractured into dust. Julian slowly backed away from the nightstand. His hands, usually so steady when holding a pen or pointing at a guilty defendant, were trembling. The sickening realization washed over him like a tidal wave. This wasn't just an affair. It was a calculated, lethal sabotage. The Rossi trial wasn't just a case to Lavinia. It was an opportunity. And Dominic wasn't just a lover. He was the executioner she had hired to dismantle her husband's legacy. He moved to the window, staring out at the blurred lights of the Philadelphia skyline through the rain. The city he fought so hard to protect suddenly felt like a cage. The silence of the penthouse was deafening, pressing against his eardrums. He had spent his entire life mastering the art of the cross-examination, learning to read the slightest twitch of a liar's eye. How had he missed the deception sleeping right next to him? As the phone screen finally went dark, plunging the room back into shadows, something inside Julian shifted. The shock and the agonizing heartbreak began to calcify, hardening into something dark, sharp, and infinitely dangerous. They thought they had outsmarted him. They thought they held the cards. A slow, humorless smile touched the corner of Julian's mouth. The trial was about to begin, but the real prosecution had just started. Morning came with the pale, unforgiving light of a Philadelphia overcast sky. The torrential rain of the previous night had reduced to a persistent, chilling drizzle, streaking the massive windows of the sleek kitchen. Julian stood perfectly still by the marble island, the low, grinding hum of the espresso machine the only sound in the cavernous space. He had not slept. Not for a single minute. He had spent the remaining hours of the night staring at the ceiling, carefully compartmentalizing his shattering grief into a tight, impenetrable box deep inside his chest. To survive the courtroom, a prosecutor had to sever his emotions from the facts. Now, he had to apply that same ruthless discipline to his marriage. Lavinia emerged from the hallway at exactly 6:30, a vision of curated perfection. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and a silk blouse that spoke of untouchable professionalism. Her auburn hair was pinned back elegantly, leaving her sharp cheekbones and calculating hazel eyes on full display. "You're up early," she observed, her voice smooth, bearing the faint, husky timbre of recent sleep. Julian handed her a porcelain cup, his fingers briefly brushing against hers. The contact, which once brought him a profound sense of quiet comfort, now felt like pressing his bare skin against a live electrical wire. He forced the muscles in his jaw to remain entirely relaxed. "The Rossi case. Opening statements are tomorrow. There is no such thing as sleep." Lavinia took a slow sip of the dark liquid, leaning casually against the counter. She looked at him with an expression of mild, wifely concern, a mask so flawless and convincing that Julian felt a fresh, violent wave of nausea wash over his empty stomach. "You look exhausted, Julian," she murmured softly. "You've prepared for this trial for months. Dominic Beaumont is securely in your pocket. What more is there to worry about?" Hearing Dominic's name fall from her lips with such casual, effortless indifference was a physical blow. Julian watched her throat work as she swallowed the hot coffee, his predatory gaze searching for a tremor, a micro-expression of guilt, a slight shift in her breathing. There was nothing. She was entirely composed, a beautiful apex predator hiding in plain sight within his own home. "Beaumont is a wild card," Julian lied, his voice a steady, resonant baritone that betrayed absolutely none of the violent storm raging inside his skull. "Men who turn on their own kind to save themselves are inherently untrustworthy. I just need to make sure his testimony is ironclad before he takes the stand." Lavinia offered a soft, dismissive laugh. It was a sound he used to love, a sound that meant she felt safe. Now it sounded like the metallic click of a loaded gun being cocked. "He's a cornered rat, Julian. He'll say whatever you need him to say to stay out of a federal penitentiary. You have him exactly where you want him." No, Julian thought, staring down into the black, unreflecting surface of his own coffee. "You have me exactly where you want me." His mind raced violently back to the digital ghost of the text message. "I have the files that will destroy Julian's case tomorrow." Lavinia wasn't just offering spousal commentary. She was actively probing him. She was trying to ascertain if he had discovered the leak, if he suspected the lethal ambush she and her lover were carefully laying out for his destruction. Julian took a measured, even breath, leaning back against the island to mirror her relaxed posture. "Perhaps you're right. The files are sealed. The evidence is solid. By this time next week, the Rossi syndicate will be completely dismantled." He watched her eyes closely, just a subtle flicker, a momentary, microscopic hardening of the iris before her lips curved into a supportive smile. "I have no doubt," she said smoothly. "You always win." She set her empty cup down on the marble and checked her gold wristwatch. "I have a deposition at 8. Will I see you for dinner?" "I'll be working late at the office," Julian replied, the lie sliding effortlessly past his teeth. "Trial prep never ends." "Don't burn yourself out," she whispered, leaning in to press a brief, chaste kiss to the angle of his jaw. The scent of her expensive perfume, normally intoxicating, now smelled like poison and rot. As the heavy front door clicked shut behind her, the locks engaging with a definitive snap, Julian finally allowed his broad shoulders to drop. The silence of the penthouse returned, heavier and darker than before. He had survived the morning. The facade had held. But as he looked at the rim of her coffee cup, stained faintly with her pale pink lipstick, he knew the real torture had only just begun. The moment the elevator door sealed Lavinia out of the penthouse, Julian moved with the sudden, predatory swiftness of a shark smelling blood in open water. The quiet luxury of their home, the imported Italian leather sofas, the abstract art, the sprawling views of the Philadelphia skyline, suddenly felt like a meticulously decorated crime scene. He needed evidence. He needed the unvarnished, brutal truth, not the polished lies she had just served him over espresso. He strode into her home office, a space as immaculate and intimidating as the woman herself. The heavy mahogany desk sat in the center of the room, dominated by her sleek, silver laptop. It was asleep, a pulsing white light indicating it was locked behind a complex alphanumeric password. Julian stood over it, his jaw tight. They never touched each other's work computers. It was a boundary strictly enforced by the nature of their opposing legal careers. But the rules of engagement had changed at 2:14 a.m. He stared at the password prompt. Lavinia was brilliant, but she possessed a fatal flaw common to many arrogant, highly intelligent people. She believed she was untouchable. She wouldn't use anything obvious, but she would use something deeply embedded in her own twisted sense of superiority. Julian's mind raced through a catalog of their life. Anniversaries were too pedestrian. Her mother's maiden name was too simple. He thought about her greatest legal victory, the case that had made her a partner at her firm. State versus Hawthorne. The verdict came down on a Tuesday. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He typed, Hawthorne 1104. The screen remained locked. Incorrect password. He cursed softly under his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. He only had a few attempts before the system would lock him out completely and alert her phone. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to think like Lavinia. Cold. Calculating. Triumphant. What was her ultimate goal right now? Destroying his case. The Rossi Syndicate. He opened his eyes and typed, Acquittal 2026. The screen flashed, the password prompt vanished, and Lavinia's desktop appeared in sharp, high-definition clarity. A sickening wave of triumph and devastation washed over him. He was in. Julian didn't hesitate. He bypassed her work emails and went straight for her encrypted messaging app, the one she used to communicate with high-profile clients off the grid. It required a secondary PIN. This time, he didn't guess. He pulled a small, specialized USB drive from his pocket, a tool confiscated during a cybercrime sting months ago, meant to bypass standard commercial encryption. He had kept it locked in his own safe for emergencies. This was the emergency of a lifetime. Within 3 minutes, the encryption cracked. The app opened, revealing a single, active chat thread. The contact name was simply D.B. Julian braced his hands against the edge of the mahogany desk as his eyes scanned the screen. The reality of his wife's betrayal, laid out in stark, blue and white text bubbles, was infinitely more grotesque than the brief notification he had seen in the dark. It wasn't just a physical affair. It was a dark, obsessive entanglement. There were hotel confirmations, the Four Seasons, the Ritz-Carlton, always booked under an alias. There were explicit messages detailing afternoons spent tangled in expensive sheets while Julian was buried in trial prep. But the true horror lay beneath the lust. Lavinia, he's finalizing the witness list tonight. You're the anchor. DB. Good. I have the secondary ledgers. The ones proving the feds tampered with the initial wiretaps. If I drop these on the stand during cross, his entire case implodes. Lavinia, keep them secure. Don't let him rattle you during prep today. He thinks he owns you. DB. Let him think it. When I destroy him in front of the jury, I want to see his face. And then I want to see yours, in my bed, celebrating his resignation. Julian's vision blurred with an absolute, blinding rage. He had to grip the edge of the desk, so hard his knuckles turned white to keep from hurling the laptop through the floor-to-ceiling window. Lavinia wasn't just sleeping with the enemy. She was architecting his professional slaughter. She was feeding Dominic Beaumont the exact weaknesses in the prosecution's armor, coaching him on how to detonate a perjury bomb on the stand that would not only free the Rossi syndicate, but result in Julian being disbarred and publicly disgraced. He took out his own phone and began photographing the screen, capturing every damning message, every date, every leaked file name. He moved methodically, his breathing shallow and tight. He was no longer a husband mourning a broken marriage. He was a prosecutor meticulously building a case against the two most dangerous criminals he had ever faced. When he had everything, he closed the app, ejected the drive, and put the laptop back to sleep. He left the office exactly as he had found it, a tomb of secrets waiting to be unearthed. The betrayal was complete, documented, and undeniable. Julian Forrester walked out of the penthouse, the cold Philadelphia rain waiting for him. The time for grief was over. It was time to go to war. The air inside the Philadelphia Criminal Justice Center was always thick with a metallic tang of anxiety and stale coffee, but today, it felt entirely suffocating. Julian pushed through the heavy brass-handled doors, his trench coat damp from the lingering rain. He wore his bespoke navy suit like a suit of armor, his expression chiseled into the impassive, terrifying mask that had earned him his reputation. The USB drive in his inner pocket felt as heavy as a loaded weapon against his ribs. He barely made it past the metal detectors before a sharp, familiar voice cut through the low hum of the lobby. "Julian, walk with me." He didn't need to turn to know it was Geneva. She fell into step beside him, the sharp click of her heels echoing fiercely against the marble floors. As the lead investigative reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, Geneva was a relentless force of nature. She possessed a terrifying intellect, an expansive network of courthouse moles, and a ruthless dedication to the truth. Today, her dark eyes were narrowed, locking onto him with predatory focus. "I have trial prep in 10 minutes, Geneva," Julian said, his voice an unbroken, resonant baritone. "The press briefing isn't until this afternoon." "This isn't for the briefing, and it isn't on the record," she countered, stepping deftly to cut off his path toward the private elevators. She lowered her voice, forcing him to lean in slightly. "There's a lot of chatter moving through the back channels this morning. Ugly chatter." Julian kept his jaw perfectly relaxed, though his pulse spiked. Defense attorneys always generate noise before a major syndicate trial. It's white noise. "It's not white noise when it comes from the Rossi camp," Geneva said, her gaze dropping briefly to his hands before meeting his eyes again. "My sources are telling me the defense isn't just planning to poke holes in your timeline. They are planning an ambush, a complete structural collapse of your case. Someone has handed them a loaded gun, Julian." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow, but years of courtroom discipline kept his face entirely blank. He thought of the text messages, the encrypted files on Lavinia's laptop, the horrifying blueprint of his own destruction. Geneva didn't know the exact details. She didn't know the bullet was being fired by his own wife, but she was circling the epicenter of the blast. If the defense had exculpatory evidence, they would be required to submit it during discovery. Julian replied evenly, citing the procedural law as if it were a shield. "Unless you're suggesting they intend to commit perjury." Geneva let out a short, cynical breath. "I'm suggesting that your star witness, Dominic Beaumont, might not be the loyal little soldier you think he is. The rumor is that he's holding on to something radioactive. Something about federal wiretap tampering." Julian's blood ran cold. The secondary ledgers, Lavinia and Dominic's digital whispers, were already bleeding into the real world. If Geneva published an article questioning Dominic's credibility before the trial began, the judge might delay the proceedings. Lavinia would realize there was a leak. The trap Julian was meticulously building in his mind would disintegrate before he could spring it. He had to contain the fire. "Geneva," Julian said, his tone shifting into something dangerously quiet and intensely sincere. He stepped closer, invading her personal space just enough to establish absolute authority. If you print a rumor based on defense fabrication, you will not only compromise a 3-year federal investigation, but you will open the Inquirer to a massive defamation suit from this office. Beaumont is secure. The evidence is vetted. Geneva studied his face, searching for the micro-expressions of a lie. Finding none, because Julian had buried the terrified, betrayed husband so deep inside that only the ruthless prosecutor remained. She slowly nodded. Fine, she whispered, stepping back. But if this case blows up in your face tomorrow, I'm writing the autopsy. And I won't be gentle. I would expect nothing less, Julian replied, turning toward the elevator. The doors slid open, swallowing him into the sterile steel box. As the car ascended, the silence rushed back in. He closed his eyes, leaning his head against the cold metal wall. The clock was ticking faster now. He had to meet Dominic Beaumont face to face, look into the eyes of the man sleeping with his wife, and pretend he didn't know a thing. The interrogation room deep within the district attorney's office was windowless, its cinder-block walls painted a sterile, unforgiving white. The air hummed slightly from the fluorescent lights overhead, casting harsh shadows across the scarred metal table. Julian Forrester sat perfectly still, his hands folded neatly over a thick manila folder. Across from him sat Dominic Beaumont. Dominic was undeniably handsome in a slick, dangerous way. Dark hair meticulously styled, eyes the color of dark roasted coffee, and a smile that suggested he always knew a joke you didn't. He wore an expensive tailored suit that seemed out of place in the sterile room, completely unbothered by the gravity of the impending trial. He radiated the kind of arrogance that only came from a man who believed he held all the cards. Julian's gaze traced the lines of Dominic's face, his mind flashing violently back to the text message. I left my watch on your hotel nightstand. He imagined those hands touching Lavinia. He imagined that smug mouth whispering lies against her skin. The urge to reach across the table and wrap his fingers around Dominic's throat was so powerful it physically ached in his jaw. Instead, Julian opened the folder. The sharp, crisp sound of paper tearing the silence was a masterclass in control. Let's review the timeline regarding the offshore accounts, Mr. Beaumont. Julian began, his voice dropping into the resonant, authoritative cadence he reserved for hostile witnesses. It was a voice utterly devoid of emotion, a precision instrument. Dominic leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers over his stomach. A subtle, mocking smirk played at the corner of his lips. We've been over this, Julian. I told the feds everything. I'm an open book. The casual use of his first name was a calculated insult, a tiny assertion of dominance. Julian let it slide off him like water over stone. An open book, Julian repeated softly, his dark eyes locking onto Dominic's. I need more than a summary. When you take the stand tomorrow, the defense is going to attempt to shred your credibility. They will suggest you fabricated the ledgers to secure your immunity deal. Dominic's smirk widened slightly, a flash of white teeth that made Julian's blood run cold. He knew the defense's strategy because he and Lavinia had written it. Let them try, Dominic said smoothly, leaning forward slightly. The scent of his expensive cologne, a sharp, spicy scent that Julian abruptly realized he had smelled faintly on Lavinia's coat the week prior, wafted across the table. It was a physical assault on Julian's senses. The prosecution has the primary ledgers, the ones I surrendered, the ones that prove the Rossi family authorized the money laundering. I have nothing else to hide. Julian felt the cold, hard weight of the USB drive in his pocket. The secondary ledgers, the ones proving the feds tampered with the initial wiretaps. He leaned in closer, matching Dominic's posture, his expression a mask of terrifying intensity. Are you absolutely certain of that, Dominic? Because if the defense has access to secondary information you withheld, your immunity deal evaporates the second you commit perjury on that stand. You won't just be going to federal prison. You'll be going there as the man who tried to double-cross the Rossi syndicate and the district attorney. For a fraction of a second, the mocking light in Dominic's eyes flickered, a tiny, almost imperceptible tightening of the muscles around his jaw. It was the micro-expression Julian had been waiting for, The visceral reaction of a liar realizing his safety net might have a hole. I don't know what you're implying, Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its breezy arrogance. I'm implying that trials are volatile, Julian replied, pulling back smoothly, satisfied with the momentary crack in the armor. He closed the folder. And I don't like surprises in my courtroom. If there's a bomb waiting to go off, I suggest you disarm it now. Because if it detonates, I promise you, I am not the one who will burn. Dominic recovered quickly, forcing a tight, dismissive laugh. You're paranoid, counselor. It's just pre-trial jitters. I'll be exactly where you need me to be tomorrow, hitting every mark. Julian stood up slowly, towering over the seated man. I have no doubt about that, Mr. Beaumont. We are done here for today. As Julian turned and walked toward the heavy steel door, he felt Dominic's eyes burning into his back. The arrogance had returned, laced with something darker, anticipation. Dominic was looking forward to destroying him on the stand, to watching Julian's career implode in real time. But as Julian stepped out into the hallway, the chilling, absolute certainty of a predator settled over him. Dominic thought he was walking into an ambush he had designed with Lavinia. He didn't know he was walking into an execution. The glow of the city lights bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting long, distorted shadows across the Persian rug in the living room. Julian stood by the heavy oak bar, pouring 2 fingers of single malt scotch. The clinking of the ice against the crystal tumbler was the only sound cutting through the oppressive silence of his home. Lavinia was seated on the plush leather sofa, her legs crossed elegantly, a glass of red wine resting delicately in her hand. She had traded her tailored suit for a silk slip dress that clung to her in ways that once drove him wild. Tonight, the sight of it only made his stomach churn with cold revulsion. He knew exactly whose hands had traced those lines recently. You've been quiet since you got home, Lavinia observed, her voice low, laced with that perfectly calibrated tone of spousal concern she had perfected over 8 years. Julian took a slow sip of the scotch, letting the burn anchor him to the present moment. He walked over and sat in the armchair opposite her, deliberately creating distance. It's the eve of the biggest trial of my career, Lavinia. The noise in my head is deafening. She offered a soft, sympathetic smile that didn't quite reach her sharp hazel eyes. It doesn't have to be. You're carrying the weight of the entire city on your shoulders, Julian. It's admirable, but it's destroying you. He watched her carefully, his prosecutor's instincts completely dialed in. Every micro-expression, every shift in her posture was a potential tell. Here it comes, he thought, bracing himself for the manipulation he knew was inevitable. Lavinia leaned forward slightly, setting her wine glass on the glass coffee table. The silk of her dress shifted, a calculated distraction. I had lunch with a colleague today. Word around the defense bar is that the Rossi camp is terrified of what Beaumont might say on the stand. They might be willing to talk. Julian's grip on his tumbler tightened almost imperceptibly. He kept his face entirely blank, a mask of exhausted consideration. Talk. They've stonewalled us for 2 years. They want to fight to the death. People change their minds when the gallows are built, she countered softly, her gaze holding his with an intensity that made his skin crawl. If you offered them a plea, something substantial but not absolute ruin, they might take it. You'd secure convictions on the lower-level operatives, dismantle a significant portion of their infrastructure, and you wouldn't have to risk the volatility of a trial. The audacity of it was breathtaking. She was sitting in his living room, drinking his wine, smoothly orchestrating the survival of the man she was sleeping with. A plea deal meant Dominic would never have to testify. He wouldn't have to face Julian's cross-examination. He wouldn't have to risk perjury, and he wouldn't have to drop the fabricated evidence that would destroy Julian's case. It was the perfect escape hatch, built by his own wife. A plea deal on the eve of opening statements. Julian mused slowly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. It would look weak. It would look like I don't trust my own evidence. It would look pragmatic, Lavinia corrected gently, her tone soothing, practically maternal. It was a terrifying performance. You've built an incredible career, Julian. You don't need this specific scalp to prove your worth. Why risk everything on the testimony of a man like Dominic Beaumont? He's a rat. Rats bite the hand that feeds them. The sheer, staggering hypocrisy of the statement hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her, marveling at the monster wearing his wife's face. She was calling her lover a rat to his face, feigning concern for his career while actively holding the knife to his throat. He is a rat, Julian agreed quietly, his voice dropping into a deadly, resonant calm that he usually reserved for his closing arguments. But I have him cornered. I have the ledgers. I have the wiretaps. If he tries to bite me, I'll crush him. He watched her eyes, just a brief, microscopic widening of the pupils, a fleeting shadow of panic that vanished as quickly as it appeared. You're very confident, she murmured, picking up her wineglass again. The slight tremor in her hand was the only indication that her control was slipping. I have to be, Julian replied, finishing his scotch and setting the glass down with a definitive thud. I've staked my entire reputation on this case, Lavinia. There will be no plea deals. Tomorrow, we go to war, and I intend to burn them all to the ground. He stood up, towering over her for a brief, terrifying moment before turning toward the bedroom. The silence that followed him was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The trap was set, and she had just confirmed she was fully committed to stepping into it. The air in Julian's private study, a heavy paneled room tucked away in the deepest corner of the penthouse, was stale and sharp with the scent of old paper and the ozone tang of overworked electronics. It was 3:45 a.m. The rest of the city was a graveyard of silence beneath the weeping Philadelphia sky, but Julian's mind was a chaotic, hyper-focused war room. He sat behind his massive oak desk, the only illumination coming from the harsh, clinical glare of his secured laptop screen. Beside it sat the small, black USB drive, the stolen heartbeat of his wife's betrayal. He had spent the last 3 hours meticulously dissecting the encrypted files he had ripped from Lavinia's personal machine. The initial shock of the affair had burned away, leaving behind a cold, terrifying vacuum of absolute purpose. He wasn't a heartbroken husband anymore. He was the lead prosecutor of Philadelphia, and he was hunting. The files were a masterclass in obfuscation, buried beneath layers of legal jargon and shell company structures that only a brilliant defense attorney like Lavinia could weave. But Julian was relentless. He cross-referenced the dates of the hotel rendezvous with the timestamps on the digital documents. Then he found it. It was buried in a subfolder labeled D.B. Depositions Drafts. It was a PDF document, seemingly innocuous, titled Secondary Ledger Extract. Rossi Corporation. Julian's eyes narrowed, his pulse thrumming a slow, dangerous rhythm against his jaw. This was the bullet they had loaded into the chamber. This was the evidence Dominic intended to drop on the stand to blow up the trial. He opened the file. It was a flawless forgery. The letterhead was authentic, mimicking the Rossi Syndicate's internal accounting software perfectly. The dates aligned with the prosecution's timeline. But the numbers, the crucial columns of illicit transfers that Julian had spent 2 years tracing, had been subtly, brilliantly altered. The forged ledger showed that the wire transfers, the ones Julian claimed were payments for political assassinations and massive narcotics shipments, were actually routed back to a series of blind trusts. Trusts that, upon closer inspection of the fabricated metadata, appeared to be linked to a federal informant within the Rossi organization. Julian leaned back in his leather chair, the leather creaking loudly in the silent room. The breath hitched in his throat as the sheer, devastating elegance of the trap washed over him. If Dominic produced this ledger on the stand, the narrative would instantly flip. The jury wouldn't see a mob boss ordering hits. They would see a corrupt federal task force funneling money to their own informant to entrap the Rossi family. It was textbook entrapment. The judge would have no choice but to declare a mistrial, and Julian's career would be incinerated in the ensuing media firestorm. Geneva and the Inquirer would have a field day. He would be disbarred, disgraced, and potentially investigated for prosecutorial misconduct. And Lavinia would be the grieving, supportive wife, standing by his side as he fell, only to quietly step over his corpse to take his place at the top of the legal food chain. He stared at the screen, a chilling, humorless smile touching the corners of his mouth. It was a beautiful piece of sabotage, but Lavinia had made one microscopic, fatal error. She was a defense attorney. She understood how to create reasonable doubt. But Julian was a prosecutor. He understood how to prove a lie. He leaned forward, his fingers flying across the keyboard, pulling up the original, authenticated ledgers from the district attorney's secure server. He placed them side by side with the forgery on the screen. He magnified the metadata. There it was, a tiny, digital fingerprint. The creation date on the forged PDF was only 3 weeks old. And the software used to generate the Rossi letterhead wasn't the outdated proprietary system the syndicate used. It was a modern, high-end legal formatting program. A program Julian knew for a fact was exclusively licensed to Lavinia's law firm. The cold stone in Julian's chest finally shattered, replaced by a searing, absolute inferno of righteous fury. He had the weapon. He had the fingerprint. He had the motive. He closed the laptop with a soft, definitive click, plunging the study into total darkness. The trial started in 4 hours. He was going to let Dominic take the stand. He was going to let him pull the trigger. And then, he was going to turn the gun around and watch them both bleed out on the courtroom floor. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 602 at the Philadelphia Criminal Justice Center swung open with a definitive, echoing thud. The air inside was dense, practically vibrating with the collective anticipation of 50 spectators, a dozen reporters, and the terrifying presence of the Rossi syndicate leadership seated behind the defense table. Julian Forrester strode down the center aisle, his bespoke navy suit immaculately pressed, his posture an inflexible pillar of authority. He didn't look at the gallery. He didn't look at Geneva, who was perched in the front row, a notebook resting on her knee like a loaded weapon. And he absolutely did not look at the third row, directly behind the prosecution table, where he knew Lavinia was sitting. She was wearing a tailored cream-sheath dress, the picture of a supportive, powerful spouse, her presence a silent, suffocating weight pressing against his spine. He took his seat beside his second chair, the low murmur of the courtroom washing over him like white noise. He arranged his legal pads with terrifying precision. The small, black USB drive, containing the stolen files and the fabricated ledgers, sat heavy in his inner breast pocket, burning a hole against his ribs. "All rise," the bailiff barked, the sharp command slicing through the tension. Judge Elias Vance, a man known for his razor-sharp intellect and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, took the bench. "Be seated. Counsel, are we ready for opening statements?" "The state is ready, Your Honor," Julian said, his voice a resonant, commanding baritone that immediately commanded the room's attention. He stood slowly, buttoning his jacket, and approached the podium. He rested his hands on the polished wood, his gaze sweeping across the 12 men and women of the jury. They were a cross-section of Philadelphia. Teachers, mechanics, nurses, ordinary citizens suddenly thrust into the epicenter of a sprawling, violent empire. Julian needed them to see not just the crimes, but the arrogance of the men who committed them. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Julian began, his voice dropping into a register that was both intimate and authoritative. "For the next 3 weeks, you are going to hear a story about power, about greed, and about the absolute, terrifying belief that some men are simply untouchable by the law." He paced slowly toward the jury box, his eyes locking onto a middle-aged woman in the front row. "The defense will tell you this is a case of government overreach. They will attempt to paint the Rossi family as legitimate businessmen, victims of a hyper-aggressive prosecution." He paused, letting the silence stretch out, heavy and expectant. "They will lie to you." A murmur rippled through the gallery, quickly silenced by a sharp glance from Judge Vance. Julian didn't flinch. "They will lie," he repeated softly, "because that is the currency they trade in. The state will prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the Rossi syndicate operated a sophisticated, multi-million-dollar money laundering operation. We will show you the ledgers. We will play you the wiretaps. We will show you the blood money." He turned on his heel, his gaze sweeping across the defense table where the mob bosses sat, their faces carved from stone. Then, he looked past them, his eyes finding the back doors of the courtroom. In an hour, Dominic Beaumont would walk through those doors. But you don't have to take my word for it, Julian continued, his voice rising, gathering a terrifying, undeniable momentum. Because you are going to hear from the architect of that operation himself. You will hear from a man who sat in their boardrooms, who hid their money, who knew their secrets. Dominic Beaumont. He saw a microscopic flinch from the lead defense attorney. He felt the sudden, electric stillness from the third row behind him. Lavinia was listening. She was waiting for the trap to spring. Mr. Beaumont will take that stand, Julian said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that carried to the very back of the room. And he will tell you the truth. Not because he is an honorable man, but because he is a cornered man. A rat who realizes the ship is sinking. It was a deliberate, brutal echo of the words Lavinia had used in their living room the night before. He didn't turn around to see her reaction, but he felt the sudden, chilling drop in the temperature behind him. He had fired the first shot. The war had begun. The state asks you to listen carefully to the evidence, Julian concluded, stepping back from the podium, his posture rigid, his face an impenetrable mask of absolute conviction. Because by the end of this trial, the truth will be undeniable, and the untouchable men in this room will finally be brought to justice. He returned to his seat, the silence in the courtroom thick enough to cut. The opening statement was flawless, but as Julian sat down, his heart hammering against his ribs, he knew the real performance was only just beginning. He had built the stage. Now, he just had to wait for the actors to take their marks, oblivious to the explosive charges wired beneath their feet. The first day of the trial had been a brutal, exhausting slog of procedural maneuvering and dry forensic testimony, designed to lay the groundwork before the main event. Judge Vance called a brief 15-minute recess mid-afternoon. The courtroom rapidly emptied, leaving behind a chaotic hum of reporters and legal teams spilling into the hallways. Julian Forster didn't follow the crowd. He retreated to the small, windowless attorney-client conference room adjacent to the prosecution table, craving the sterile silence. He poured a paper cup of tepid water from the dispenser, his hands steady, his mind racing through the precise sequence of questions he had prepared for the afternoon session. The heavy door clicked shut behind him. Julian turned slowly. Dominic Beaumont stood leaning against the doorframe, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, an expression of predatory amusement playing across his handsome features. He looked entirely out of place in the grim, fluorescent-lit room, radiating the relaxed confidence of a man holding a winning lottery ticket. "Counselor," Dominic said smoothly, stepping fully into the small space and letting the door latch shut. The sudden isolation was absolute. Hell of an opening statement. A cornered man. A rat. Very theatrical. Julian took a slow sip of water, his dark eyes fixed on Dominic. He didn't offer a seat. He didn't speak. He let the silence stretch, forcing Dominic to fill it. Dominic's smirk widened slightly. He moved closer, invading Julian's personal space, the faint, spicy scent of his cologne, the scent of Lavinia's betrayal, filling the cramped room. "I thought we should have a quick chat before I take the stand tomorrow," Dominic murmured, his voice dropping into a low, confidential register that sent a violent spike of adrenaline straight through Julian's chest. "Just to make sure we're on the same page regarding the scope of my testimony." "The scope of your testimony is outlined in your immunity agreement," Julian replied, his voice a flat, deadened monotone. "You will answer my questions regarding the primary ledgers. You will confirm the wiretaps. Nothing more." Dominic chuckled, a dark, humorless sound that scraped against the cinderblock walls. He leaned closer, his dark eyes flashing with a sudden, vicious triumph. "That was the old plan, Julian," Dominic whispered. "The new plan involves a secondary set of ledgers. Ledgers that prove your federal task force was illegally funneling money to a confidential informant within the Rossi organization to manufacture this entire case." Julian forced his breathing to remain shallow and even. He willed the muscles in his jaw to tighten in a display of sudden, barely contained panic. He needed Dominic to believe the ambush was a complete surprise. If you introduce fabricated evidence on that stand, Julian said, his voice dropping to a harsh, strained rasp, I will have you indicted for perjury before the jury even leaves the room. They aren't fabricated, Dominic countered softly, his smile now a full, terrifying grin. They are verified, authenticated, and they are going to blow a hole in your timeline so massive the judge will have no choice but to declare a mistrial. The Rossi family walks. I walk. And you? He paused, letting the implication hang in the heavy air. You go down in flames as the most corrupt prosecutor in Philadelphia history. Julian stared at him, letting the silence stretch into a long, agonizing beat. He allowed a microscopic tremor to enter his hands as he crushed the paper cup. Why? He asked, his voice raw. You have immunity. You're clear. Why destroy the case? Dominic leaned back slightly, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. Because I can. And because a very persuasive, very beautiful woman suggested it was the most efficient way to ensure my long-term survival. The blood roared in Julian's ears. It took every ounce of his discipline, every year of his training, not to lunge across the small room and tear Dominic apart. He was dangling Lavinia like a trophy, confirming the depth of the conspiracy. Here is the ultimatum, Julian, Dominic said, his tone suddenly flat and businesslike. Tomorrow, during direct examination, you are going to ask me about the discrepancy in the March wire transfers. It's a subtle question. The jury won't understand it, but I will. It's my cue to drop the secondary ledgers. You will look shocked. You will scramble. And then, you will concede the point. You will let the case collapse under its own weight. And if I refuse? Julian asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dominic stepped back toward the door, his hand resting casually on the brass handle. If you refuse, I still drop the ledgers. But I also drop a very detailed, heavily documented file to Geneva at the Inquirer. A file containing hotel receipts, text messages, and explicit photographs detailing a very passionate, ongoing affair between myself and your lovely wife, Lavinia. An affair that, coincidentally, involves her feeding me the exact prosecution strategy you're using today. He opened the door, the ambient noise of the courthouse flooding back into the room. It's a simple choice, counselor, Dominic said, his smile returning. Lose the case, or lose the case, your career, your wife, and your reputation. See you on the stand tomorrow. The door clicked shut again. Julian stood alone in the center of the room, the crushed paper cup in his hand, his heart hammering a violent, triumphant rhythm against his ribs. The blackmail was explicit. The threat was real. He didn't feel defeated. He felt like a god standing over a chessboard. They had just handed him the final piece. The penthouse was a tomb. It was past midnight. The rain had finally stopped, and the Philadelphia skyline was a cold, glittering expanse of indifference beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Julian sat in the suffocating darkness of his study, the only illumination the harsh, white glare of his laptop screen. He had spent the last 4 hours re-examining the encrypted files he had stolen from Lavinia. He had Dominic's blackmail ringing in his ears, the arrogant ultimatum, the threat to expose the affair, the promise to destroy his career. But something about the sequence of events, the precise calibration of the threat, felt meticulously orchestrated. It didn't feel like the desperate power play of a cornered mob accountant. It felt like the strategic masterpiece of a defense attorney. Julian's eyes scanned the timeline of the text messages between Lavinia and D.B. again. He focused on the dates. October 12th, Lavinia initiates contact. Discusses the weakness in the Rossi wiretaps. November 3rd, first hotel reservation. The affair begins. January 15th. The forged ledgers are created on Lavinia's firm's software. Last week, the blackmail plan is explicitly detailed. The cold realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. Dominic Beaumont hadn't seduced Lavinia to get to Julian. Lavinia had seduced Dominic to destroy Julian. He leaned back in his leather chair, the leather creaking loudly in the silent room. His mind raced back through the last 8 years of their marriage. The subtle, escalating professional envy. The way she celebrated his victories with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. The quiet resentment when he was floated as a potential candidate for the upcoming Attorney General race. Lavinia didn't just want to win cases. She wanted the throne. But as long as Julian was the untouchable golden boy of the district attorney's office, her path was blocked. She needed a scandal. A catastrophic, public failure that would disbar him and clear the board. The Rossi trial was the perfect vehicle. Julian opened a new folder he had decrypted earlier that evening. A folder buried deep within her personal financials, completely disconnected from Dominic. It contained draft press releases, meticulously written and timed for the exact moment the trial collapsed. They positioned Lavinia as the brilliant, shocked spouse, devastated by her husband's prosecutorial misconduct, ready to step up and heal the fractured legal system of Philadelphia. The blackmail wasn't a threat Dominic had conceived to save himself. It was a loaded gun Lavinia had handed him, designed to ensure Julian had no choice but to tank the case. If Julian fought the forged ledgers on the stand, Dominic would leak the affair, destroying Julian's reputation and providing Lavinia with the perfect, sympathetic motive for divorce. If Julian folded and let the case collapse, he was ruined professionally, and Lavinia still won. It was a flawless, lethal checkmate. A hollow, agonizing laugh scraped its way out of Julian's throat. He had spent his entire career hunting monsters in the dark alleys of the city, never realizing the most dangerous predator was sleeping next to him. She had calculated every variable, every emotional response. She knew his pride. She knew his dedication to the law. She had used his own virtues to build his scaffold. He closed the laptop, plunging the room back into total darkness. The silence of the penthouse pressed against him, heavy and absolute. The betrayal was complete, but the grief had finally burned away, leaving behind a terrifying, absolute clarity. Lavinia thought she was playing chess with a husband who loved her. She didn't realize she was sitting across from a prosecutor who was about to deliver the closing argument of his life. He didn't just need to convict the Rossi syndicate anymore. He needed to incinerate the board. He needed to trap Dominic in a perjury charge so airtight he would spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. And he needed to use the very weapon Lavinia had forged to tear her apart in open court, ensuring that when the dust settled, she would be standing in the ashes of her own ambition. Julian stood up slowly, the muscles in his jaw tight. Tomorrow, he would take the stand. He would let them spring the trap. And then, he would show them exactly what happened when a dead man decided to take everyone down with him. Courtroom 602 was filled to capacity, the silence so absolute it felt brittle. The jury box was a row of strained, attentive faces. The press gallery, with Geneva front and center, leaned forward collectively, sensing the electric current in the air. At the defense table, the Rossi leadership watched with cold, flat eyes. And in the third row, directly behind the prosecution table, sat Lavinia Forrester. She wore an immaculate charcoal suit, her expression composed, the supportive wife waiting for her husband's victory. Julian didn't look at her, but he could feel the cold weight of her gaze against his spine. "The state calls Dominic Beaumont," Julian announced, his voice a resonant boom that shattered the quiet. Dominic walked down the center aisle, the picture of relaxed confidence. He wore a sharp, navy suit, his dark hair perfect, a faint, arrogant smirk playing on his lips. He took the oath, settled into the witness box, and adjusted the microphone. He looked directly at Julian, a glint of anticipated triumph in his dark eyes. Julian approached the podium slowly, his posture rigid. This was the moment. The trap was set. Dominic was waiting for the cue, the question about the March wire transfers, so he could detonate the fabricated ledgers and destroy the trial. "Mr. Beaumont," Julian began, his voice surprisingly soft, echoing slightly in the vast room. "You are testifying today under an immunity agreement with the state, correct?" "That's right," Dominic replied smoothly. "An agreement predicated on your complete and total honesty regarding the financial operations of the Rossi syndicate." Julian paused, letting the weight of the words hang. "An agreement that is null and void should you introduce fabricated testimony or evidence into this courtroom." Dominic's smirk didn't waver. I understand the terms, counselor. Julian leaned on the podium, his dark eyes locking onto the witness. The air in the room suddenly felt dangerously thin. Let's discuss the nature of hidden transactions, Mr. Beaumont, Julian said, his voice dropping into a deadly, rhythmic cadence. In your experience as an accountant for a criminal enterprise, is it common practice to utilize secondary, encrypted ledgers to conceal the true nature of an operation? A microscopic tightening appeared around Dominic's eyes. He shifted slightly in his chair. It's possible. Yes. And these secondary ledgers, Julian continued, his voice rising a fraction, taking on a harder edge, they require a high level of sophistication to create, don't they? They require an intimate knowledge of the primary system to seamlessly integrate the fabricated data. They require a partner. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. In the third row, Lavinia's posture became unnaturally rigid. Julian could feel the sudden, terrifying realization blooming behind him. Objection, Your Honor, the lead defense attorney barked, standing up quickly. Vague and argumentative. Where's the state going with this? I'll allow it for now, Counselor, Judge Vance ruled, leaning forward, his gaze fixed sharply on Julian. But get to the point, Mr. Forrester. The point, Your Honor, is the integrity of the witness, Julian said, his eyes never leaving Dominic. The smirk had vanished entirely from the witness's face, replaced by a tight, wary expression. Dominic was waiting for the cue. He was waiting for the March wire transfers. Mr. Beaumont, Julian said, stepping away from the podium and moving slowly toward the witness box. On the night of November 3rd, you engaged in a transaction at the Ritz-Carlton, room 412. A transaction that was not documented in any of the primary ledgers you provided to the state. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The defense attorney jumped to his feet. Objection. Relevance. What does a hotel room have to do with the Rossi Syndicate? Dominic stared at Julian, his face draining of color. The arrogant facade cracked, revealing the sudden, raw panic beneath. Julian was using the hotel room where the affair began as a metaphor for the conspiracy. He wasn't just exposing the affair, he was exposing the blackmail in real time. It goes directly to the witness's credibility, Your Honor. Julian fired back, his voice a crack of thunder. He turned to the judge, his expression an impenetrable mask of absolute, terrifying conviction. The state intends to prove that Mr. Beaumont, in collaboration with an unnamed co-conspirator, utilized specialized legal formatting software not owned by the Rossi Syndicate, to fabricate a secondary set of ledgers. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled, the defense table exploded in furious whispers, and Judge Vance hammered his gavel repeatedly. Order. Order in this court. Vance roared. Julian turned slowly back to the witness box. Dominic was gripping the edges of the wood, his knuckles white, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He looked past Julian, frantically searching the gallery for Lavinia. Mr. Beaumont, Julian said softly, his voice cutting through the dying echoes of the gavel. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out the small, black USB drive, holding it up between two fingers. Are you familiar with the metadata fingerprint of the software used to forge the document titled Secondary Ledger Extract, Rossi Corp? The silence that rushed back into the room was heavy, suffocating, and final. Dominic swallowed hard, his throat working visibly. He looked at the drive. He looked at Julian's cold, dead eyes. The blackmail threat was useless now. Julian had already burned the bridge, exposed the forgery, and held the evidence to prove it. If Dominic tried to introduce the fake ledgers, Julian would immediately prove they were fabricated by Lavinia, sending them both to federal prison for perjury and conspiracy. Dominic was trapped. The immunity deal was his only lifeline, and Julian had just wrapped it around his throat. Dominic started, his voice a dry, reedy rasp. He looked at the jury, then down at his hands. The fight completely drained out of him. The arrogant mob accountant was gone, replaced by a terrified man staring at a life sentence. I'm not familiar with that document. Julian lowered the drive, a slow, humorless smile touching the corner of his mouth. It was a complete capitulation. The threat was neutralized. The Rossi case was secure. "Thank you, Mr. Beaumont," Julian said, his voice dropping back to the resonant, authoritative baritone. He turned his back on the witness box and walked slowly back to the prosecution table. "The state has no further questions for this witness at this time." He took his seat. He didn't look at Geneva, who was furiously writing in her notebook, her eyes wide with the realization of the massive story unfolding before her. And he absolutely did not look behind him, to the third row, where Lavinia sat perfectly still, trapped in the horrifying realization that her brilliant, meticulous plan had just been completely, brutally incinerated by the man she thought she had outsmarted. The trial would continue. The syndicate would burn. But as Julian stared at the blank legal pad in front of him, he knew the real execution had already taken place. The gavel fell for the final time in courtroom 602, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot through the high, vaulted ceilings. Judge Vance's voice, steady and grim, delivered the verdicts. Guilty on all counts for the Rossi leadership. A life sentence for the syndicate's brutal reign. The gallery erupted into a chaotic symphony of reporters shouting into phones, victims' families weeping in relief, and the heavy thud of bailiffs moving to secure the prisoners. Dominic Beaumont was led away in handcuffs. His immunity deal revoked the moment Julian presented the digital forensics, proving his intent to commit perjury with the forged ledgers. Dominic had looked back only once, his dark eyes wide with the terrified realization that he was going to federal prison for a very, very long time. Julian Forrester stood slowly at the prosecution table. The adrenaline that had sustained him for 3 grueling weeks vanished, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion that settled deep into his bones. He methodically packed his legal pads into his leather briefcase. The sharp snaps of the brass locks the only sound he registered beneath the din of the clearing room. He didn't smile. He didn't acknowledge the congratulatory slaps on the back from his junior team. He just waited. Slowly, the courtroom emptied. The reporters rushed out to file their stories. The spectators dispersed. The bailiffs secured the doors. Finally, only 2 people remained in the vast, wood-paneled space. Julian turned around. Lavinia was still sitting in the third row. The immaculate charcoal suit she wore on the first day was gone, replaced by a simple, severe black dress. Her posture, usually a flawless picture of untouchable elegance, was rigid and fragile, like spun glass on the verge of shattering. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating, filled with the ghosts of an 8-year marriage and the wreckage of a profound, calculated betrayal. Julian picked up a thick manila folder from the table. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't a trial transcript. He walked slowly down the short aisle, the sound of his footsteps unnaturally loud in the empty room. He stopped at the edge of the low wooden railing that separated the gallery from the well of the court. Lavinia looked up at him. For the first time since he had discovered the text message, the mask had entirely slipped. Her sharp hazel eyes were wide, tracing the hard, unforgiving lines of his face. There was no defiance left, no arrogant calculation. Just the stark, horrifying reality of absolute defeat. She had tried to architect his destruction, and he had used her own blueprint to build her a cage. Julian didn't speak. He reached over the railing and placed the thick manila folder on the polished wood bench beside her. He didn't need to explain what it was. The thick stack of papers inside contained the heavily documented evidence of her affair with Dominic, the forensic analysis of her laptop proving she had forged the Rossi ledgers, and the drafted press releases exposing her intent to sabotage a federal prosecution. It was enough to have her disbarred instantly and indicted for conspiracy. Resting precisely on top of that mountain of ruin was a single, pristine sheet of paper. The divorce decree, already signed by Julian Forrester. Lavinia stared at the folder, her breath hitching audibly in the quiet room. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her perfectly manicured fingers hovering over the edge of the manila envelope as if it were radioactive. "You didn't submit it to the ethics board," she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thread. "You didn't expose me during the trial." Julian looked down at her, his dark eyes completely devoid of the warmth or the fierce protectiveness that had once defined their marriage. He felt nothing. The rage had burned out, leaving only a cold, sterile vacuum. "I exposed Dominic," Julian replied, his voice a flat, resonant monotone that scraped against the silence. "He's going to prison. The Rossi family is dismantled. I secured the conviction. That was my job." He watched her throat work as she swallowed hard, a single, agonizing tear finally breaking loose and tracing a slow path down her cheek. It was a terrifying, beautiful display of grief, but Julian knew it was for the loss of her ambition, not the loss of his love. "And this?" she asked, her voice cracking as she touched the edge of the divorce papers. "What is this, Julian? Mercy?" A slow, humorless smile touched the corner of Julian's mouth. It was a cold, terrifying expression that didn't reach his dead eyes. "It's leverage," Julian said softly, leaning closer so only she could hear the absolute finality in his tone. "If you ever step foot inside a courtroom in this city again, if you ever attempt to practice law, or if you ever breathe a single word of this to the press, I will file that folder. I will take everything you have left. You are done, Lavinia. You are a ghost." He stood back, adjusting his tie with mechanical precision. He picked up his briefcase, the weight of it pulling at his shoulder. He turned toward the heavy oak doors, the silence of the empty courtroom pressing against his back. "The jury gave me the win, Lavinia," Julian said, his voice echoing softly into the cavernous space without looking back. "But you gave me the sentence." He pushed through the doors, stepping out into the cold, blinding light of the Philadelphia afternoon, leaving his wife alone in the wreckage of their ambition.